Hello, everyone. Welcome to 'Tis the Season for Heat Awareness, What You and Your Team Need to Know, presented by Sam Steele, NALP Safety Advisor. This webinar is hosted by the National Association of Landscape Professionals. My name is Lisa Wood, and I will be the moderator. Before we begin, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, we encourage you to use the chat panel located on the bottom right-hand corner of the control panel on your screen. To ask a question, click on the chat box and type in your request, and then click Send Privately box and direct your questions to me, Lisa Wood. We will answer your questions towards the end of the webinar. If we run out of time, we will follow up with you via email. All telephone lines are on mute for this call. This webinar is being recorded. If you are a member of the National Association of Landscape Professionals, you may access it online in the Member Center section starting next week. And now I will turn the presentation over to Sam.
Thank you, Lisa. Welcome to our program this afternoon here from the NALP in Fairfax, Virginia. My name is Sam Steele, as she already indicated. And we're going to talk about heat stress today. We had some discussions early as we were planning this program for today about whether it was going to be a little bit too late to do a heat stress webinar, but if you're in the Mid-Atlantic or pretty much most of the U.S. right now, it's not too late to do a heat stress hazards program. And so we decided to go ahead with it here in July. And I know, having grown up in the Mid-Atlantic region, we still have probably quite a bit of hot weather left coming up in the month of August and early September. So hopefully today we'll answer some of your questions and clear up some issues you have about your heat stress program. I would like to remind you that in terms of what OSHA would like to see out there when it comes to heat stress, they'd like to see heat stress policies and programs that you have in written format, that you've got copies of, that you could have just in case you've got, and it should be part of the, like I indicated, part of your overall written safety and health training program. And heat stress is one that, in addition to things like first aid and CPR, programs on, let's say, for example, you do a lot of shrub pruning and hedge pruning and those kinds of things, which would indicate you probably ought to have a ladder safety written program also. But it'd be nice to have some safety and health policies on heat stress and then a written safety program, because if you ever have an inspection, that written safety program is going to be a very important part of that inspection. So one little thing that I'd like to do in terms of housekeeping, one of my responsibilities here at NALP as the safety advisor is to answer questions that you may have from things like our webinar, or questions you have about safety and health training programs at your firms or at your location or in the work that you do. And one of the member benefits here at NALP is being able to contact me, and I work with firms. Originally, back in the 70s and 80s, I was in the landscape business, so I've had some of that kind of experience on the job also. And I guess I've been doing safety advising now for NALP about 5 to 7 years. So let's get started, because we have a limited amount of time. If you have to leave the program early and you want to ask a question later, please direct your questions to NALP through Amy Easterday. And Amy will get those questions off to me, and if it requires a phone call, I'll call you from my home office, which is actually located in State College, Pennsylvania. So let's take a look at heat stress and some of the things. There's some terminology here. Some of it's a little on the medical side. Some of it's just slightly technical. But let's try to clarify some things and some misnomers also about heat stress. Okay, there we go. There we go. Okay, I went one too many. So what you should have up on your screens there where you are is this statement that we wrote down here: don't allow hot and humid weather to take its toll on your employees. Remember, water, rest, and shade. And that's something that OSHA is really promoting right now as a theme for heat stress programs. This presentation, we're going to be delivering information on an introduction to occupational heat exposure. We're going to talk about heat illness and heat stress and the definitions of those things. We're going to look at recognizing some heat stress symptoms, and these can be a little bit complicated and a little bit confusing, so hopefully we'll clear up some of that. We're also going to look at tools for predicting the onset of heat stress conditions, weather conditions causing heat stress, some other factors contributing to the onset of heat stress like medication and the age of some of your workers, and then prevention or the preventing of heat stress among your workers. So as an introduction, many workers in both indoor and outdoor environments are exposed to heat while working. This involves work where there's high air temperatures, radiant heat. For example, an employee who may be working close to some machines, zero-turn mowers, for example, or riding mowers. Sometimes the engine's pretty close to the operator, so you've got some radiant heat coming out. High humidity, it's pretty humid here today in Fairfax, and it may be where you are also. Direct contact with hot surfaces or objects like muffler systems and so forth, and strenuous physical activity all can result in heat-related illnesses. All the above factors and other circumstances are potential exposure factors for landscape workers. Now, during this presentation, we'll carefully examine these contributors to heat stress and suggest methods for preventing or limiting their impact on the safety and health of your workers. So the first term I wanted to handle is one that's kind of medical. It's called thermoregulation, which the definition of is the ability of the human body to adjust to excessively cold or excessively hot environmental work conditions. Now further, when exposed to hot working conditions, the body must be able to get rid of excess heat and to maintain a stable internal temperature. And the normal range is around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If the body cannot regulate normally the body core temperature, especially when you've got high temperatures outside under the high temperature work conditions, the body core temperature will rise to dangerous levels. And I'm going to give you one example that came from a report that was done through NIOSH about an incident that occurred about 16 years ago. So we'll be talking about the inability of the body to thermoregulate in that case. And then the term acclimatization. This is a term that you should be familiar with because this refers to the gradual ability of the human body to adapt to increasingly more strenuous physical activity that takes place in a work environment with higher temperatures and humidity. Essentially, new hires in the landscape industry may be asked to do outdoor work for which their bodies are not prepared or acclimatized. New hires, I was on a call last week with an individual who works for OSHA, and they have statistics now that show that new hires, a person working during their first week on the job in outdoor activities, represent a reported 70% of all heat-related fatalities. It's a huge number during the first week. So new hires are at high risk. Acclimatization may take a well-planned week or two of increasingly more strenuous work each day. And management's going to have to pay a lot of attention to that, putting together 5 to 10 days or a little bit more than that of work that becomes a little bit more strenuous. And I know I was in the business. It's a very difficult thing to do. It takes an awful lot of planning, but you need to work with for example, crew managers, crew supervisors to make sure that the acclimatization is taking place with your new hire workers. Acclimatization now, on the other hand, can be undone in 3 to 5 days. For example, we've had probably 5 or 6 days of rain off and on here in the mid-Atlantic region. It's just been a strange weather, like I said, 5 to 6 days. And not an awful lot of maintenance activities, mowing and trimming and so forth are getting done. So there's probably some companies that are getting behind because of the wet mowing conditions. And if the workers haven't been really doing the strenuous mowing, trimming, edging, and work that they normally do, some of the acclimatization that you may have worked hard on over the last month or so is being undone. because it can be undone, as it shows right there, in about 3 to 5 days. It all depends on the individual. And again, it all depends on the individual, how long it takes them to be acclimatized. So heat illness and heat stress, I decided to go with these 6 different types of heat illness or heat stress, and they're listed on the left-hand side there. And I'm going to cover each one. When you get to some of these on this list, is actually as you go down the list, the symptoms become more pronounced and the results become more life-threatening. So we'll talk about that when we get down there. So here's a brief description of some of the symptoms, and I'll deal with each one, starting with heat fatigue. Under most work conditions, new or replacement workers, again, your new hires, who are not used to warm work environments and have not been acclimatized, they're prone to what's called heat fatigue. Symptoms include impaired sensory-motor skills and impaired mental or vigilant decision-making. Since many landscape workers may be using powerful machinery, like, for example, the very popular zero-turn mowers, very powerful and popular zero-turn mowers, what are the potential risks when heat fatigue sets in? So I asked this question: could an operator of a large piece of commercial mowing equipment, for example, make an unsafe choice of taking a shortcut or use the machine carelessly to get the job done quicker? And the answer is yes, that could happen. And with zero-turn mowers, I was just involved in a little meeting this morning downtown before I came out here to do the webinar, and they were talking about in the Southeast the number of commercial mower incidents that have occurred over the last 5 to 7 years, and it's pretty alarming. So you want to ensure that your employees are well rested. Good luck there. You know, you say, did you all get lots of rest last night? Because we're going to have a pretty strenuous day out there. We're trying to get caught up. So hopefully your employees are not spending the night up and going to concerts till the wee small hours of the morning. And are they still acclimatized to the working conditions they'll be exposed to each day? How about heat rash? I put this in there because I know I've myself, in some of the work that I did back in the day when I had my own landscape firm, it's also known as prickly heat. It's a very common problem in hot work environments. Body areas that are exposed to restrictive clothing often become covered with red papules that cause a kind of like a prickly sensation, which is where the name prickly heat comes from. So if you've got an individual with profuse sweating that keeps the skin continually wet under warm conditions, it can cause a skin infection called heat rash. Typically, heat rash usually cures itself when the victim returns to a cooler, drier environment. Heat collapse, and it's fainting. Heat collapse is usually the result of blood that pools in the body's extremities, legs, for example, and is not carrying enough oxygen to the brain. This can result in a lack of consciousness very quickly and unexpectedly. It happens very quickly. So what you've got here is probably an individual, if they spend a lot of time sitting on a large piece of commercial mowing equipment, they should stop every once in a while, turn it off, put the brakes, turn the engine off, put the brakes on, and just take a couple minutes of exercise around the machine, get off the machine, and you probably are going to help a lot eliminate the potential for heat collapse. Workers who are not used to or prepared for strenuous work during warm and humid weather are prone to this level of heat stress. Heat cramps. Heat cramps are attributed to an electrolyte imbalance related to sweating during hard physical work. Health practitioners suggest that the symptoms result from both too much or too little salt. The water lost by excess sweating while working must be replenished in order to minimize heat cramps. Now, this last paragraph here in this first sentence is very important. We don't want you to get used to using thirst as a guide to water replenishment. So water should be taken every 15 to 20 minutes under hot working conditions. And don't allow the workers to get used to say, well, I'm kind of thirsty, I'm going to stop. it should be more of a routine thing that they replenish the water in their body on a regular basis and not just when they're thirsty. Heat exhaustion. Don't be confused about the symptoms of heat exhaustion with things like a common cold. As this says here, heat exhaustion will mimic an upset stomach, headaches, nausea, vertigo, muscle weakness. Thirst and giddiness may indicate the onset of this serious ailment because of what it can lead to. Do not ignore the serious implications related to heat exhaustion and fainting while operating a machine or machinery, and as a precursor to a heat stroke, which we're going to cover next. Coming to work tired to begin a new workday may increase the risk for heat exhaustion. And again, we just hope that your workers are getting plenty of rest, especially on days when they're going to be exposed to hotter working conditions and a fairly long day. I was going to mention as we started that we've almost had a perfect storm over the last month or so. We had some very hot conditions here, and I saw where on a map of the U.S. where those very hot outside conditions impacted a huge 100 million or so of our population areas in the U.S. At the same time, it's about the time of the year that all the landscape work, the lawn care work really geared up. And at that time, with new hires on the job, we had kind of like a perfect storm. And I think heat stress would have been and continues to be, of course, as the summer goes on, a fairly serious problem. So let's go on to the one that probably from a medical standpoint is the most dangerous. It's a medical emergency. It's called heat stroke. I can vouch for heat stroke because as an 18-year-old and going out for football on my football team, I actually suffered a heat stroke, and I was actually in the hospital overnight till they got me stabilized. It occurs when the body's temperature regulation system, again, that thermoregulation we talked about, is unable to maintain a normal body temperature at or near 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Symptoms of a heat stroke include confusion, irrational behavior, a loss of consciousness, convulsions, a lack of sweating, hot, dry skin, and abnormally high body temperature at or above 105.8 degrees Fahrenheit, and for an adult, that's an extremely high temperature. Some medications critically increase the onset of a heat stroke. Workers should carefully check their medicinal labels for warnings about operating machinery and so forth after taking their meds and also working under very hot outside conditions. Organs shut down, making recovery from a heat stroke very difficult. There's a program in the U.S. that's sponsored by NIOSH, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. It's called their FACE program. You could go on to their internet site and find hundreds of workplace fatality reports. No names are mentioned in these reports, but they've been done in a number of states since the late 1990s across the United States. This is a NIOSH FACE report of a fatality that involved a heat stroke from the state of Michigan in 2002. So I broke it down this way to show you just how dangerous a heat stroke can be. The type of work that was being done was residential lawn care, included on that day at the various residences where this crew was working, mowing, edging, trimming, and backpack debris blowing the sidewalks off and so forth. It was a two-person crew. The victim was a laborer, older, not a real old person, but middle-aged person. There was a crew supervisor and this laborer. The maximum temperature, and I want to underline this particular sentence for you, wasn't 91 degrees or even in the mid to upper 80s. The maximum temperature that workday, as measured by the local weather service, was 81 degrees Fahrenheit during the afternoon time period. About 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the laborer came to the crew supervisor, and again, this is a 2-person crew, and said he felt lightheaded and short of breath. And the crew supervisor, crew manager, wanted him to take a rest, find a shady spot, a cooler, shady spot, have some cool water. And he refused to do that. He said, no, I'll be fine. And so about 5 p.m., 2 hours later, they were at another residential site in their normal work routine, and he collapsed, and the crew manager took the truck and took him to an emergency care facility, and his rectal temperature at the emergency room was measured at 107.6 degrees Fahrenheit. That's extremely high. And the organs shut down, and they were unable to save this person's life. This, again, was 16 years ago in the state of Michigan. And there are similar reports to this in terms of heat stress fatalities across the U.S. There's still a number of states that do these FACE reports, and you can gain access to them by simply going on the NIOSH website. And so, okay. Just want to check the time here. Sometimes I get carried away, and so I think we're in good shape here. So methods for treating heat stress conditions. Now that we've covered those 4 different levels of heat illnesses, don't hesitate to call for the EMS services, EMS and paramedics. If you've got an individual who may be suffering from heat exhaustion and or heat stroke, it's a very critical emergency. You need to remove the victim from direct sunlight to a cooler and shady location. Don't be fooled by, as in that FACE report from 2002, about an individual making a quick recovery or refusing any kind of assistance, because it could be just the next stage could be something that happens that'll be irreversible. 2 definitions that I want to cover that relate to heat stroke. This one is what's called non-exertional heat stroke. It's abbreviated NEHS. This type of heat stroke results from abnormally high body temperatures of 105.1 or higher, and is caused by excessive environmental heat. Now, this is different than an individual who's doing very strenuous work outside. About 10 years ago, I moved to the East Coast from Chicago, and Chicago had a tremendous heat wave that lasted for weeks, and there were hundreds of fatalities, heat illness fatalities among the elderly in Chicago, mostly in non-air conditioned residences, and there were no people checking on these people, and it was a tragic summer in Chicago that year. And that would be defined as non-exertional heat stroke. These people were sitting in non-air conditioned facilities where the temperatures were going higher, almost akin to how they're talking about don't leave your pets and children in cars with the windows closed because the temperature can go up so quickly to very high temperatures. Those are non-exertional heat stroke symptoms. For us, with landscapers and construction workers and individuals involved in high strenuous type of physical activity, this is called EHS, or exertional heat stroke. And this type is more common among outdoor workers, as I've indicated up there. And believe me, it's not limited to just older individuals, and it can severely impact your young and healthy workers, even those who have not taken any medications. And we'll talk a little bit more about medications as we go through this. New hires, replacement workers, and other workers who, again, have not been acclimatized to a hot work environment are especially at risk. And you've heard the terms hypothermia versus hyperthermia. Normal body temperature, this is the 3rd time you've seen it on a slide here, and most people know that the normal body temperature is around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If you notice down below here, the difference between hyperthermia, which is an elevated body core temperature. That's what we're talking about today versus more winter conditions of hypothermia. There's only a 6.7 degree difference between those two conditions. That wouldn't seem like much, but believe me, when it's your core body temperature, it's a large, very important and large medical conditions that you should be considering. So here's some recommendations from OSHA. Hopefully you're able to see this on your screen and it's not too small, but I wanted to put this OSHA information on one screen. There is no, let me clarify something. There is actually no OSHA standard for heat stress, but there are different OSHA, like for example, the general duty clause. Some of the recommendations that OSHA has within their various regulations talk about occupational heat exposure factors like rising temperatures, high humidity, and a combination of those two things, intense sun exposure, the lack of air movement, machines that radiate a lot of heat because of their high temperatures, the strenuous work, and then there are both in OSHA and EPA, there is a reference to personal protective equipment, the PPE, and whether that's the appropriate type of PPE for hot weather work. The OSHA General Duty Clause simply states that employers are required to provide their workers with a place of employment that is free from recognizable hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious harm to the employees. That's that General Duty Clause. And that's important because you need to take that into consideration with your hot weather work type policies and programs that you develop training on. The OSHA Personal Protective Equipment Standard, and there's the standard number right there, 29 CFR 1910-132, for determining the appropriate PPE. There is that one, and look in the parens there, it's got a D, that's based on occupational heat exposure. That's one that if you get the opportunity, go to the OSHA and just type that in on your computer where you're doing your search, and that'll come up and it'll tell you more about personal protective equipment and what you should be providing to your workers when they're working under hot weather conditions. And also under OSHA, I wanted you to be aware that there are 28 states in the U.S. that have what's called a state OSHA plan. And some of those plans, the OSHA plans in those states have to be at least as strict as the federal OSHA plan, and many of those state OSHA plans have more specific occupational heat exposure regulations. And one of those states is California, that has a state OSHA plan. And in 2015, Cal OSHA, or the state, the people that administer the OSHA plan in the state of California, excuse me, clarified the wording and requirements on their heat illness prevention programs. Here are just two. There's more than these, but I wanted to put these two in there. In 2015, the first revision was they wanted to state specifically a provision for water, that the water must be fresh. This is the water that's available to the workers. It must be fresh, pure, suitably cool, and provided free of charge. And what was happening was there were actually some firms that hire workers who work outside in construction, landscaping, and other fields where they were actually charging for the water that the employees were drinking. It has to be provided to the employees free of charge. And number two, access to shade. Employees taking a preventative cool-down rest shall be monitored and asked if he or she is experiencing symptoms of heat illness. In other words, don't take a person who may be having heat stress symptoms or heat illness symptoms and put them into an area and then no one stays with them or observes them or watches them. They could go on to a more serious heat illness symptoms and nobody would be there to assist them. So be very careful. Your cool down rest areas must be readily accessible, meaning near the work site. It's not a good idea to take a person, have them sit down in the truck which may be just as warm or warmer than the conditions they were exposed to. So again, cool down rest areas must be readily accessible. Now the EPA Worker Protection Standard, which you see abbreviated EPA WPS, also has some information about the personal protective equipment that can be used. This is usually during pesticide applications and the use of pesticides and so forth. And there are some things under the EPA Worker Protection Standard that you should probably refer to. So if your firm, landscape firm or otherwise, does do any licensed pesticide application, you do want to refer to those portions of the Worker Protection Standard that deals with the proper PPE to wear during pesticide applications. And right there, find the additional guidance at www.epa.gov, and then you could put /PPE. There's some important tools for predicting heat stress conditions. Most of you probably know that the Weather Service has weather maps, like, for example, this example I used here from NOAA, heat products located on that map, color-coded map, show excessive heat warning in one color, an excessive heat watch in another color. This is kind of like tornado warning, tornado watch types of things that the Weather Service does. And then there's also a heat advisory level there. So these are available. My recommendation is that someone in your firm, if the weather, you know the day before, the morning of, earlier that morning that there's going to be hot weather conditions that your employees are going to be exposed to, I would pull up these maps and just see where you stand and see how hot it's going to be that day and plan for those kinds of things. And maybe what you want to do is get your employees out there a little earlier when the weather's a little on the cooler side. And then also, as you schedule the work, you probably don't want to schedule the really strenuous work in the middle of the day or the hottest time of the mid-afternoon. You probably should try to schedule the really strenuous work earlier in the day or when the weather's not as hot. And if there's any way you can schedule that real strenuous work for later, that would be a good idea. Here are some other contributors to occupational heat stress. I think I mentioned before age. You can see that older workers are not able to adjust as quickly to sudden increases in temperatures. That means their body's thermoregulation system is not able to adjust as quickly. That's just natural. That's part of aging. Older workers are more likely to have some medical conditions that inhibit the body's normal ability to respond to hot and humid work environments. For example, they may be on a beta blocker for high blood pressure, and that can seriously impact the ability of the body to thermoregulate and keep that body cool. Some of the prescription drugs that older workers take, and they have to take them, including they affect the ability of the body to cool itself with perspiration and evaporation. Also, we'll talk a little bit more here about medications. Medications include prescriptions and over-the-counter drugs like antihistamines. I'm sure you've had employees or do have employees that are affected by allergies. And antihistamines, check the labels, have your workers check those labels, and just see how the hot weather conditions are going to affect their ability to cool their bodies down. Beta blocker meds, I mentioned that, for high blood pressure are problematic. Heat stress normally increases your heart rate or the pumping of blood in vessels under the skin where convection can rid the body of some heat. That's all part of the thermoregulation system. And beta blocker heat stress symptoms are difficult to assess at the work site because fellow workers will not recognize the magnitude of the medical emergency sometimes until it's too late, especially when a heat stroke has reached a critical stage with that extremely high body core temperature, like our example from that Michigan FACE report. Alcohol is a diuretic, meaning that it promotes dehydration in the body. And this condition interferes with the body's ability to regulate its own temperature and may support the onset of different heat illnesses or heat stress. Fluids that would normally cool the body through perspiration are more often excreted as urine when the body dehydrates. And you need that fluid to cool the body. One of the heat stress stages, namely heat exhaustion, is characterized by dehydration. If left unrecognized and untreated, the more serious heat stroke stage may follow the tragic consequences, including, and again, I would mention these high temperatures, body core temperatures of 105 degrees Fahrenheit, and can result in organ failure and, unfortunately, death. Stimulants are products that increase body activity and may be taken for weight loss, depression, and other conditions. So check product labels, have your employees check the product labels for prescription drugs that are on, and have them observe the health warnings that are on those labels. And they need to make you aware of those kinds of things before they're exposed to hot and humid work conditions. So preventing and reducing the potential for heat stress among your employees, here are some bulleted areas that you should pay attention to. Carefully monitor workplace temperature and humidity. I think the key to carefully monitoring workplace temperature and humidity is a job early in the morning before the crews go out of management to do that. Then it becomes the job of the crew supervisor, the manager. This person, he or she, is with the workers that day. They know what the workers are being exposed to, and they're really a key to providing that the water on a regular basis, providing some rest periods in cool and shady areas to make sure that these employees are not starting into various stages of heat illness. Again, I mentioned here, schedule the physically demanding work during the cooler hours, typically in the morning during cooler hours. Acclimatize your workforce. We've talked about this in phases. 5 to 10 days is a typical acclimatization period. But again, remember that can be undone if, for example, let's say you have a teenager working at your firm, his family's taking a vacation, he has to take that week off and go with the family to the beach. When he comes back, he needs to be acclimatized again if we're having hot work conditions, because he's lost some of that ability to, the acclimatization ability that his body had developed. Encourage crew supervisors to observe and interact with each crew member on a regular basis. Oftentimes, the crew managers and supervisors are workers and part of that crew. And this is an extra chore that they really need to do on hot, humid days. Make sure on a regular basis they're checking on all their crew members. Provide shade, rest breaks, and liquids. And where there are extremely high temperatures, I think you really need to halt work, because you may be having employees dropping like flies. Train your workers to recognize heat stress. And right here is something that we're really promoting, and I know OSHA promotes, a buddy system. You should really not have an individual working by themselves doing mowing or trimming hot, strenuous work unless there's another person nearby that has them visually in view. So a buddy system is a really good idea. So between the buddy system and enhanced observation by the crew manager, I think you're going to go a long way to preventing some of these serious symptoms and serious results from heat illnesses. So here's some things to remember that we talked about already. We talked about thirst as not being a good indicator of the need for drinking water on the work site. You need to provide it on cool water on a regular basis. Occupational heat stress has side effects that may not be apparent to the worker or the supervisor. So it would be a good idea, as I mentioned before, to have your hot work or heat stress potential policies in place. All your workers need to know about that. At the time of year when they are getting exposed to hot weather work conditions, there should have been some training done to help the fellow workers recognize some of the symptoms. from themselves and their fellow workers. Again, acclimatization is probably 5 to 10 days, and with some individuals, it could take 2 weeks to get them fully acclimatized to the work conditions, and that can be undone in 4 to 5 days. So keep that in mind also. Just don't say, well, I acclimatized them. I really paid attention to it. You may have a person that missed some work because they were injured for a little bit of time and they took off, or they were on vacation and came back. You're going to have to re-acclimatize those people. And again, based on that Michigan 2002 FACE report, it does not take extremely high temperatures for the onset of heat stress. Remember, the highest temperature that day that individual developed the heat stroke symptoms and resulting in his death was 81 degrees that day. So it doesn't take 91, 101, and the heat index of 110 to cause these heat illnesses. Even the mildest types of heat stress can seriously affect the ability of workers to operate machinery. Some of the high-powered commercial machinery that we use out there today that make the job so much more efficient and so quicker to get done, even these types of heat stress can lead to just like a domino effect kind of thing where the ability of the workers to operate machinery is seriously impacted. Firms where air temperatures can be extreme need a hot weather work training program. And again, that key word with training programs and policies that you have for your workers is that those programs be in a written form and that they be available in the event of an inspection, or they're available to your employees to know what the policies are and what the training program is, and make sure that you follow through with some training programs. I just wanted to, and the words here, the letters are small, but OSHA's Heat Illness Prevention Campaign, which was launched back in 2011, 7 years ago, you can, again, this is just like the EPA Worker Protection Standard. You can go online at www.osha.gov and then put a slash in there and look for the heat illness prevention campaign materials and so forth that are available. It educates employers and workers on the dangers of working in heat, and they are really promoting that, again, this time of the year, very similar to a lot of work that's being done on hearing conservation programs and other health issues that impact landscape workers. Every year, dozens of workers die in all industries from hot weather work, working in extreme heat and extremely humid conditions. And then there you'll see it says that more than 40% of heat-related worker deaths occur in the construction industry. For those of you that have been online with us today, it's just as important in the construction industry and people working in roofing. I know that's an extremely high-risk industry. So then you can look at the OSHA laws and regulations and so forth. And again, OSHA recommends make sure you provide your workers with water, rest, and shade. That's kind of like the theme. Allow newer returning workers to gradually increase their workloads and take more frequent breaks as they acclimatize or build a tolerance for working in the heat. Plan for emergencies and train your workers on preventing heat illnesses, and monitor your workers closely for signs of illness. And again, I think that's really an important job of the crew manager and in the buddy system of the fellow workers that are out there on the crews. OSHA has an occupational exposure to heat page that's available to you, and there's also more information there. So what our plan was to try to finish up in about 45 minutes. I think we've done that. I think we're about right on time. And we may have some questions from individuals there. And let me remind you that if you have to leave the presentation now, but you do have a question, but there's some other pressing matters going on, make sure you contact NALP and contact Amy Easterday, and Amy will make sure that your questions and concerns that you have are relayed on to me, and just as soon as I get back to my office, I'll make sure that I get to you just as quickly as I can. So Do we have some questions from anybody?
Not at this time. If you have any questions, please feel free on the side of your computer screen to go ahead and enter them now. We'll be happy to share them with the group. All right, at this time, I do not see any questions coming through, so if something does come up and you'd like to ask a question, okay, I see one. I'll just go ahead and answer this really quickly. Jerry asks, are we required to provide water, or can we ask that coworkers bring their own?
In California, the example I used about Cal OSHA, I know, for example, in that state that does have to be provided, and you can't charge for it in California. So they specify that the water has to be provided by the employer for the workers, and the water has to be cool, clean water, and it cannot be something that's charged on to the employee. But in terms of water, yes, it really is your responsibility to provide the water for the crews.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody else have any questions? Mostly the questions seem to be about the PowerPoint and the slide and the webinar, whether it will be able to be viewed again. We will have it available on Friday on our website, and we can also send everybody that had registered for this webinar a link to the webinar as well if you're not able to access it through our website. So we will make it available with the slides for everyone that has registered. Okay. And I did want to mention one other thing before we conclude. For those of you that are interested in additional safety training, you'll notice on our website we have some upcoming webinars, one including August 1st. The webinar is entitled Coaching Safety at the Management Level. So if you're interested in that, please visit our website. So at this time, I want to thank Sam for a great webinar. And in order for us to improve our future webinars, please take a few moments to fill out our evaluation, which will appear on your screen at the end of this call. We appreciate your feedback, and we would like to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.